Did your parents have cliche go-to phrases that they used all the time that just kind of drove you nuts? My mom's here. If anybody wants to pile on her about any phrases as a representative here, she can do that. The phrases that drove me crazy, and it still drives me crazy. People say, be careful. I'm either walking somewhere dangerous or I'm not, right? I'm walking somewhere dangerous, I'm not. Being careful in this situation, is that going to make a difference or not? And I tell my kids that, and I realize it doesn't mean anything, but I say, be careful. They'll say on the way home, drive safe, watch out for deer. Like, how am I going to watch out for deer and watch them hit my car? Like, what am I going to do? It drives me crazy. Be careful. Be safe. When I was your age, this is the one that drives me crazy. Like, what do I care? What about when you were your age? It's not the way that things are now. When I was your age, and then I say it to my kids. We're driving down the road. We're going on a long trip. And they say, I didn't download enough movies onto my tablet. Like, you know what I did when I was your age? I looked out the window and listened to whatever Dad wanted to listen to. That's what I did when I was your age. In the real world, like, and like, you don't think this is real? Right now, what I'm dealing with in high school, doing these things, dealing with the drama, dealing with the people. You don't think this is the real world right now? In the real world. And the one that absolutely just drove me bonkers the most is life's not fair. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Of course it's not fair. What do I do? Life's not fair. This happened. Sometimes it's, they got this and I didn't get that. Life's not fair. And you just deal with it. There's sometimes that phrase is just really not helpful. Like you've got a teacher that just doesn't like you and is hard on you for some reason, and you just tell your parents, "Oh, life's not fair." Like, no, I need advice on how to deal with this teacher. I don't need a phrase that's unhelpful. And I still don't like life's not fair. Like it's okay to say life's not fair, even to the kids say, life's not fair. That's the way it is, but here's how you handle that. To just say life's not fair, deal with it, is not helpful. I want to know what I'm supposed to do. And today I just want to focus on a guy that life was not being fair. God was not being fair. And how God took care of him through that and what he did in that. That's what we're going to look at today. At least that's what God wants us to look at today. From what I can tell, based on the sermons he would let me write and wouldn't let me write. That's what we're going to look at today in Acts chapter 24. Now, Paul was a guy motivated by love, but he was also motivated pretty heavily by guilt. We talk a lot about forgiving ourselves, and we can talk about whether that's in the Bible and that's the thing we need to do or not. But he's not a guy that forgave himself for what he did. He stood there and held the coats and kind of was a ringleader when Stephen was executed. When he was not executed, he was stoned to death by a mob. That wasn't execution, that was murder. He stood there. And he carried that burden his whole life. As far as we know, there were no other murders that he participated in, but he definitely participated in persecution. He was the one that was the ringleader to persecute the Christians in Jerusalem. And then when all the Christians left Jerusalem, he's the guy that came up with the idea to take the thing international, to go out and find them in other places. And he carried that guilt his entire life. And he talks about it over and over. He says, I'm the worst of sinners. And he's not just talking about the fact that he's still struggling with whatever he's struggling with, but he carried that guilt of not just being a Christian, but a Christian who had persecuted other Christians. And he carried this his whole life, and it framed the way that he did things. And so whenever he was beaten, we get lots of stories about him being beaten or him being stoned. There's never a point where he gets mad and balls up back on him. Like, he doesn't do that. And it's largely motivated by his guilt. At least that's what I think. But in Acts chapter 4, we see the beginning of the end for Paul. And what's happening for Paul is he has not been to Jerusalem in a while because they want to kill him there. So he doesn't go back to Jerusalem. And he decides he's going to go back to Jerusalem. And we can have a debate, if you want to have a debate about whether he was supposed to or not. I really think the Holy Spirit told him several times not to go to Jerusalem. They warned him not to go there. He goes into one place, and I think the guy's name was Agabus. He goes into this place, and Agabus takes Paul's belt, and he sits down on the floor and ties himself up with this belt and says, this is what's going to happen to you if you go to Jerusalem. He gives his warnings over and over, but he goes anyway. He said, I don't care about the persecution. I don't care what's going to happen. I'm going to go anyway. And so he goes, and he gets to Jerusalem, and he's there for the first day. And then the next day, James, the brother of Jesus, half-brother of Jesus, pastor of the church at Jerusalem, one of the pastors there anyway, the guy that wrote the book of James, and some other guys come to him, and they say, They want to kill you. You don't understand. They hate you more than they hate us. And they hated lots of Christians because they were Christians, but they hated Paul specifically. And it's not just the Jews that hated Paul. Everybody hated Paul. He was like an equal opportunity person to be hated. Okay? The Jews hated him because he was the ringleader, and now he's a traitor. He left. He was supposed to be the one that was leading us. He's the rising star. He's the shining star of the persecution party, and he left. The Christians don't trust him. Because again, like we got 7 deacons, first time we've ever had this, and he is the ringleader in killing one of them. And then he runs us out. So these people that are supposed to forgive him, a lot of them have had to leave their homes, leave their families, leave their businesses, leave their jobs, leave their lives behind, and flee with their kids in the middle of the night because of Paul. And they don't trust him, and they don't like him. So the Jews don't like him, and the Christians don't like it. The Gentiles don't like him. A lot of them don't. Most of the time they don't care. But he has a tendency to go into places and disrupt the economy. He goes into one place and there's a girl following him, that she's a slave girl that can see the future, and she's prophesying and telling stuff. And he gets tired of her doing this. And so he casts the demon out of her that's allowing her to do this. And the whole city gets upset because she was making people lots of money. There's another time that he goes into a place and these people convert, and they take all these pagan books that they've got and they burn the books. And there are people upset about that because of what he keeps doing. He causes a lot of trouble for the silver trade in the city of Ephesus. And people don't like him. So you've got the Jews that don't like him. You've got the Christians that don't like him. You've got the Gentiles that don't like him. Nobody likes him. And he goes to Jerusalem, and James says, it's good to see you, but nothing has changed and nobody likes you. And they think that you're preaching a lot of things. Some of the things that you're preaching that they're actually talking about. And some things they're just telling lies about. But they don't want you here. So here's what you need to do. You need to get a couple of guys. There's a couple of guys here that need to go to the temple and worship, but they don't have the money to do it. So what you're going to do is you're going to take them to the temple, and you're all going to go there, and you're going to worship, and you're going to pay their fees to get in. You're going to pay their taxes so that everyone will see that you're still a God-fearing person, that you're not saying that Abraham never should have done anything and the temple should be torn. You're not saying any of that. You're still someone who believes in our God. Go there and worship. And Paul's like, I don't know that I should do this, but I'm going to do this. So he goes. He goes to the temple. And he's quiet. He doesn't bother anybody. He goes into the temple. And he's got these 2 guys with him. And while he's in there, just quietly minding his own business, trying to worship, do what he's supposed to do, the people spot him. And there starts to be a riot there in the temple, and they grab him and drag him out of the temple. And it's bad enough that the priests send word to shut the temple down, to close the temple down, don't let anybody in or out once he's out, because we don't want this riot spreading from outside back in. So they take him out, and they begin to beat him. And a cohort of Roman soldiers is nearby, and they come over. Now, I don't know how long you think a 911 call takes to go through, but you call 911, they get the dispatch. If you got somebody ready comes in, you got 2 or 3 minutes to get there. If it's a really good time, if they're really close, and maybe it's 7 or 8 minutes for them to get there if they're not right on the nose and ready to go. I mean, that's pretty good response time. But I want you to imagine you're being beaten in the street. 2 minutes is a long time when you're being beaten in the street. 7 minutes is a long time when you're being beaten in the street. But we got to get a cohort of Roman soldiers to come over. And there were no cell phones. We don't know how long this lasted, but he's being beaten in the street. And the soldiers arrest him because they assume he's done something wrong. And they're dragging him out. And he says, can I speak to the crowd? And he speaks to the crowd in Hebrew, and they listen for a minute until the part that he gets to the part about Jesus. And then they lose their minds again and say, kill him now. The soldiers drag him off. They put him in jail. And while he's in jail, they figure out what's going on, find out what's happening, find out he's a Roman citizen. So this makes this a political issue because Roman citizens had rights that not everybody else had. And if they allowed something to happen to a Roman citizen, then the Roman government was going to step in and just kill a whole lot of people for allowing this to happen because the Romans wanted Roman citizens to be protected. They find out he's a Roman citizen, so they're worried about it and they're protecting him. Middle of the night, Paul's nephew finds out that there's a plot to kill him. He says, the next day, the high priest and the council are going to ask that you bring Paul out, and there are 40 men that have sworn that they will not eat or drink until they have killed Paul. And between the jailhouse, which is the Roman headquarters, and the place where they're going to do his questioning, they're going to kill him. So the Roman centurion gets all the soldiers together. He says, we're sneaking him out of here in the middle of the night. And they sneak him out of the middle of the night and take him to Caesarea, which is the Roman capital of that area. It's where the Roman governor was. So he's there. He's moved away. And he's there for a week in jail, waiting on the Jews to send representatives to come over and participate in his trial so they can figure out what's going on. So Paul hasn't done anything. Right? He did something. He went over and above. He paid somebody else, 2 other guys, fees to go to the temple and worship. He's doing everything he's supposed to do. He's submitting to the wisdom of the people. And through no fault of his own, he is beaten, arrested, probably not gently, thrown in jail for a week, moved under cover of darkness to another place where he's put into another jail. And life's not fair. I'm sure that was very comforting to him to know that life is not fair. These guys show up. And they're going to have a trial. So he is seated there between the governor, who is going to make a decision in the case. The governor is sitting there. And then you've got Paul over here going to make his defense. And you've got the best that the Jews have to offer come to make accusation against him. And that's where we are in Acts chapter 24. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. And they laid before the governor their case against Paul. Now, it's 5 days. He'd been in jail for a couple of days. Then they had to travel to get there. So it's at least a week that he's been locked up during all this time. He's been there locked up. And what the Jews do is really interesting. They get this guy named Tertullus. They don't get a Jew to come and work with them. They don't get one of their people. But instead, they go out and hire a Roman lawyer to come in and speak Roman to the Romans so that everything works out well. They hire this guy named Tertullus, and they lay before governor their case against Paul. What I like to think about is how would things be different if Paul had never converted? Who would be the one making this case against the guy that's out preaching? It would be Paul. He would be the one that was over there. He was the star. He was the lawyer. He was the one that was out leading these things in persecution. Paul would have been the one that was standing there. And if you want to know why do they hate him so bad, it's because they planned on Paul being the one that would stand before the Romans and make accusations against others in these cases. But Paul has switched sides. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation." Now, I want to tell you about Felix just a little bit. Felix, he talks about him being most excellent and having a lot of foresight. And he was an evil, bribe-taking coward. He was one of the worst leaders of this Roman province ever. His brother was the treasurer for the Roman Empire, worked directly under the emperor at the time, which I believe was Emperor Nero, who was directly under him at the time, and he needed to get his brother a job. So he got his brother a job. And he used it to get rich and didn't last very long because he was bad at it and took too many bribes. But they're going to flatter him. They're going to say, "Hey, you're such a great guy. We're not going to talk about everything that you've done. You're such a great guy. Lots of reforms are being made under you for this nation. And we've never been in better care than in your hands, Felix. Never, ever. And in every way and in everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude." We're just so excited about what you've done for us here. "But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him." Now, he makes 3 accusations against him here. He says, first of all, that he stirs up riots everywhere he goes. And that's kind of true. Because he goes and preaches and then people riot. But that's not his fault, right? They could just not riot. He goes and he preaches and they stir up riots. If you had this kind of accusation against you, every time they do this, this happens. When it's somebody else causing it that's just chasing you around causing problems. Like you stir up trouble everywhere you go. You're always causing problems, but it's this other person that's following you around. You know what? We followed him and seen what's going on, and everywhere he goes, there's a riot. I don't know how that happens. There's a riot. He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Nazarenes, this is what they would call the Jews. They consider, or not the Jews, the Christians. They hadn't started calling them that yet. But they were called Nazarenes. But after Jesus, and there's a whole thing there, but they're called Nazarenes. He's a ringleader, which most of the churches in Jerusalem, or in that area of Jerusalem, would have been really upset to find out because they didn't like Paul. But he's out planting churches in other places. He's a thought leader. He's writing a lot of stuff, so he's a ringleader there, even though most of them don't like him. And he even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. What they accused him of is they said whenever he took those two guys in, they'd seen him with two Gentiles. And they just assumed that the two guys he was walking with in the temple were two Gentiles. And he was bringing them into Jew-only areas of the temple. They said, look, I understand we shouldn't have caused a riot. I understand he's a Roman citizen because this is a really big deal for them to attack and beat a Roman citizen. He said, we were just trying to stop him from profaning the temple by bringing these Gentiles in. You're welcome. I understand, but we got it taken care of. They make 3 accusations against him. Some of them are kind of true, but they've been twisted to the point that it's not even close to the truth. And one of them is true, but is not a crime. To be a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes is not a crime. He hasn't done anything wrong. But they say by examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. Just ask and you'll find out. And what's Paul going to do? Say, no, there are not riots everywhere I go? Is that what he's going to say? Because that's what happens. Is he going to say, no, I'm not a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes? Because he is. That just doesn't mean anything. And he can say he wasn't profaning the temple, but who's going to speak up in his defense? You want to talk about life's not fair? What's he supposed to do? How is he supposed to defend himself? What is he supposed to do against these accusations? The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. In verse 10, Paul gets a chance to speak. And it's a good thing that he's a lawyer because he's fighting for his life here. He gets to speak and defend himself. And when the governor had nodded him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. And I just want to point out, you can tell who the good guys are by how much they flatter the bad guy. Right? The other's like, you're so awesome. Like, you're such a great guy. We're so glad you've made such great decisions. Like, the way that you allow your buddies to get licenses to do things that other people don't get a fair shot at, and the way that you have profited off it. It's so great, and we're so excited about this. And Paul's flattery is, I know that you've been here a long time. Like, you want to know who the bad guys are? See how they flatter the other bad guys. He says, I know that you've been here for a long time, and I cheerfully make my defense. Verse 11, you can verify, just go back and look, just go back and check, ask around, that it has not been more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. So he's been there a period of time, not more than 12 days, since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. And they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. You cannot find anyone that will testify without lying that I was causing any trouble. I was minding my business. I wasn't even preaching. I have not preached since I've been here. I preach every day. I haven't preached since I've been here. And you can't find anyone that will tell the truth and tell you I wasn't fighting with anybody. I wasn't debating with anybody. I was minding my business everywhere I went. And they cannot prove to you what they now bring up against me. They can't, all these things that they're saying, they can't prove any of it. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call the sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. But this I will confess to you, I am a member of the way. He didn't like being called a Nazarene. He called the Christians something else, called them the way. That's what they would call themselves. And I think we made a mistake by letting that go. I think that we should be the way. I think that's because that's cool. I like that. He said, I will confess that I am a Jew that believes in the writings of the Old Testament, that believes in the law and the prophets. I believe these things, and I am a part of that. Whether I'm a leader or not, I don't know, because most of them don't like me, but I believe everything written down in the law and in the prophets. But I have a hope, having a hope in God, which means these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. These men in this room are Pharisees. They agree with me about everything that I believe, that there will be a resurrection, that this is going to happen. But where we differ is on the source of that resurrection, the source of that hope. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience both toward God and man. We agree about this. I'm a Jew. I don't know why we're in a Roman court for this. We agree on a ton of stuff here, but they don't like me because I preach about Jesus. Now, after several years, verse 17, I came to bring alms to my nation to present offerings. And while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. So I came down. I'd been collecting money from Jews spread all over the world. I've been collecting money from them. And I brought it down to give to the temple and to give to the poor of the city to help them. This is what I came to do. And to worship at the temple. And while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple. I'd followed all the rules. I'd gotten clean the right way. I'd done everything I was supposed to do. I was not causing any problems. But some Jews from Asia, the people that cause me trouble everywhere I go. And by the way, verse 19, they ought to be here before you to make an accusation. None of these people that are here accusing me were there. None of them know what was going on. The people that accuse me should have made the trip if they want to make an accusation, but we're going to leave that alone. Should they have anything against me? Verse 20, or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council. He said, the only thing I did wrong is when I was before the council, in verse 21, other than this one thing, that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. Paul was in the crowd, and he knew that there was a division among the council that was there. The Sadducees were the political group. They were mostly priests. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in anything spiritual. They just believe in the customs and power. The Pharisees believe everything, but they're super strict about it. And he was there, and they were all coming at him, and he shouted out, I am only here because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And that got the Pharisees and the Sadducees fighting. He said, the only thing I did wrong was turn them against each other. And I'm not even sure that's wrong. So he says all these things. They make accusations. He makes a defense and says, I haven't done any of this stuff. And if I have, what proof do they have that I've done any of it? What am I supposed to do about this? What are you supposed to do about this? The only thing I've done wrong is say what I believe. In verse 22, but Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way. Felix knows what's going on. He knows about the political climate. He knows what's happening here. He knows what everybody's dealing with. He understands exactly what they're arguing about. Put them off saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Lysias the tribune is the head of the Roman cohort that was there, the one that was in charge that brought him down. He said, when he comes and he makes testimony about what happens, then I'll make a decision. Except it turns out that Lysias must be very busy because Paul sits in prison for 2 years from this point. He orders that he be placed in jail, and for 2 years, Paul sits in prison, and the capital of the Roman province was there for 2 years. Don't worry, Paul. Life's not fair. Doesn't that make you feel better? You're going to sit in jail for 2 years. What did I do wrong? Nothing. But they brought a really good case to convict me of this, so that there's a really good reason why they were convinced. I mean, he really snookered them. He got them in there. No. They didn't even make a good accusation. Why are you in jail, Paul? Because the Roman governor didn't want to deal with this. Let me tell you why the Roman governor didn't want to deal with this. The Roman Empire was not, despite what we're taught in Western Civ in high school, the Roman Empire was not the only thing going on in the world. There was another empire right on the border of the Roman Empire that took up most of Asia, and there was a buffer zone between the two of them that went back and forth. And one of the dominant powers in that buffer zone was the nation of Israel. And they traded hands back and forth. And so this was a place that was always in flux. It was a place that no one wanted to be. If you remember back when Pilate had Jesus, right? Pilate had Jesus and he could have released him. Why didn't he release him? Because he was worried about the Jews rioting. Why was he worried about that? Because he'd already been told twice not to keep the Jews under control. And if he let the Jews get out of control again, then he was coming back to report what had happened and why it had happened to the emperor, and somebody else would take his job. So he allowed them to kill Jesus because he knew that they had power to cause him all kinds of trouble. We get to Felix. Felix is the exact same job. His job is to keep the Jews in check so that they don't rebel and allow this other empire that's right on their border to step in and take control of this buffer zone. And so he says, what am I supposed to do? Because on one hand, I've got a Roman citizen that is being attacked and abused. And if I mess up with this Roman citizen, I'm going to be in trouble. And on the other hand, he's got Jews that are saying to him, if you don't allow us to deal with him the way that we want to, we're going to cause you trouble. You're not only going to lose your job, but you could lose your head. And he says, I don't know what to do. Because I know this situation and I know that Paul is innocent. But I'm not willing to put myself on the line to do what's right. So instead, I'm going to put him in jail for 2 years. And the only reason it only lasts 2 years is because at the end of 2 years, Felix is moved somewhere else. And a guy named Festus takes over. And at that point, Paul doesn't get out of jail, but gets moved. You want to talk about life being unfair? Can you think of anything more unfair than this? We talk about things being unfair, like this person has this and I don't have that. This person gets to do that and I don't get to do that. But Paul is sitting in jail for 2 years, not convicted of any crime, but waiting on a government official to get around to making a decision. Life's not fair. What do you do with that? Sometimes it's the petty stuff. We say life's not fair. Like this person got that and this person didn't get it. The kids will come through and they'll say, well, this person got this big of a slice and I got this big of a slice and life's not fair. And sometimes it's very, very different. Sometimes it's a lot more serious and a lot more real than that. You're not willing to play politics at work because you feel like, you should be honest and God is leading you to do the right thing here and somebody else isn't. And so they keep getting promoted over and over and over. Meanwhile, you're carrying a larger share of the work, getting paid less, getting farther in it. And you say, what am I supposed to do? And I say, life's not fair. Deal with it. Get over it. You come in and you're working harder than everyone else and everybody else because of whatever reason is getting put ahead of you. Some of you are in a life's not fair situation that you went into a marriage and y'all were both happy and things were good, but one person decided that they were going to honor God in the marriage and the other person decided they weren't. And now you're stuck in a marriage and God says honoring me means sticking it out in the marriage. That's what it means. And the other person has no interest in making anything better and now you're stuck in this situation and you say, this isn't fair. I'm honoring God, and honoring God is leading me into a situation that is miserable and that I can't get out of. You have a kid, and you did everything right, and you took all the vitamins, and you exercised while you were pregnant, and you didn't drink any coffee or have any sushi, and then the kid is born a few weeks early and has a ton of health problems. Meanwhile, all these other people out here smoking and doing meth and everything else, and they're popping out healthy babies left and right. And you say, this is not fair. It's not fair. And that makes you feel better, right? It makes you feel better to say life's not fair. What are we supposed to do? I say life's not fair. And that to me immediately goes to kind of a petty thing. It goes to the kid thing about, their slice of pie is bigger than my slice of pie. But we're dealing with some very real things where life is not fair. We don't understand why God is not working and God is not moving. What's He doing? And we look at Paul. What did Paul do? Paul did everything that he thought he was supposed to. He didn't even flatter the governor. He went in and he was told the truth. He explained exactly what it was. Every time that he was beaten, he didn't get back and fight back, but he took it as a martyr. Every time that he went into a place and knew what was going to happen to him, he endured it and he honored God through it because of the guilt that he carried. He was more faithful than everybody else. There was a verse that I read, and I forget what it was, but I texted it to a bunch of people because I thought it was funny, that Paul was talking about I think it was 2 Corinthians. He was talking about the other disciples and how the other apostles, and he said, I work harder than all the other apostles. I'm like, I wonder how Peter and John felt when they read that letter. I work harder than everybody else. I'm out here doing this. And God's response It's to allow unfairness of the cruelest kind to step into his situation. He's still alive. He's still breathing. He can do all of that. But this is so unfair. And we say to the kids, life's not fair. And what we mean by that is get over it. But is that the right response? How should we handle things when God throws something at us and it's just not fair? Like, the health is not fair. And we don't understand why we get burdened with this and that person doesn't. And it's not fair. The job gets handed to somebody else and not us. And it's not fair. The marriage is falling apart even though we've done everything we're supposed to. And it's not fair. What are we supposed to do? I just want to point out verse 23. So Felix, in verse 22, understands exactly what's going on and says, I'm going to wait until we get another witness here. And that witness is apparently never going to come. And then he says this in verse 23. He gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody. He's going to be in jail. But have some liberty. And that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. So, what does this mean? You think of the jail system. I don't know if you've been over to the Benton County Jail. I have been. I've always been on the right side of the glass. Don't worry about that, but I've been over there. And they get fed, right? Somebody feeds them 2 or 3 times a day. They get to go out and get exercise. We have prisoners' rights, and we provide for them while they're in jail. They had no concerns about that at this time. There would be some food there, but it wasn't high-quality food. The idea was that if you're in prison, this is your problem. And so if you wanted to eat, other people would have to bring in food for you. And they could bring in whatever they wanted to. Generally, what would happen is you would bring stuff into your family members and you just bribe the guards to get in. That's what everybody else would do. You bribe the guards and you get to bring in food or books or Monopoly, whatever it is that you want to bring into them to help them endure the time there. You would bribe the guard. But here's what he said. He said, look, I want him in jail, but nobody stop him from allowing his friends to come in and out and take care of it. Now, he is officially limited in what he can do. He's in jail. And nobody's going to say to me, you know what, it's in jail, but it's not that bad. He's in jail, but it's not that big of a deal because of the circumstances. He's in jail. It's miserable. It's not his fault. It's not fair. But what has God done? He's met his needs in a way that nobody else in jail gets his needs met. Because if you have enough food to share, maybe you could share it. But if you don't have enough money to bribe the soldiers, you're not getting the food in. But God has allowed this unfairness, but He's also said, I'm going to take care of them through this unfairness. He's not going to be out making tents. He's not going to be out making money, but I'm going to care for him through this. Don't allow anyone to stop him from meeting his needs. In the midst of the unfairness, whenever everybody else that's in that unfair situation is starving to death in prison, Paul is being fed. He has his wants met. It's not just his needs, but his wants. You want to bring in food, you got to bribe that. And you know what? Unless you're rich and have plenty of money to do this, in which case you can probably just bribe him to be let out. You're not bringing in other stuff. But he says, whatever his friends want to bring him, bring that in. In the midst of this unfairness, he is officially limited, but God is providing his needs, and He's providing a lot of his wants. He's bringing in what he needs to take care of it. You're still not where I want to be. But in the midst of that, God is taking care of him. He's also under Roman protection. I don't know that you pick up on this, but this is the first time in a long time that Paul is going to not endure regular beatings and stonings. In a situation where he would normally be beaten quite often because he goes around preaches and the crowd gets mad at him, he's going to go for the rest of his life, as far as we know, he is not going to be beaten again until the point where his head is cut off. He is going to be pretty safe. And it is only because of that unfairness that he is taken care of. That God used that unfairness to protect him for the rest of his life. Not only that, but in the midst of this unfairness, he gets a persecution bonus. That was a joke. I'm thinking board games here. He gets a persecution bonus because he is being limited. This is unfair. Because of for the sake of the gospel and the sake of the name of Jesus, he is being persecuted. And here's what Jesus said about people who are being persecuted. In Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 11, he said, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." What Jesus said is when you endure persecution, when you're obeying me and things are just not going the way they're supposed to, and I allow you to walk into unfairness, or I allow you to walk into actual persecution, or I allow you to walk into a difficult circumstance and you lose because you're following me, I reward you for that. Now let's agree that there is a difference between the persecution of having your head cut off for believing in things and the persecution of being limited in your job because you're obeying God. Those are different kinds of persecution. But if you are following Jesus and His path leads you into things that are beyond your ability to do anything about, He said to the other disciples, He said, it's difficult for a rich man to go to heaven. And they said, what are we supposed to do then? What's going to happen to us? We're not rich. And the idea was that we were going to have to buy our way in, that the better we did with money, the more God was blessing us, the more happy He was with us, so we were going to get in. And they said, what are we going to do? And He said, anyone who has lost houses or fields or family or lands will receive 10 times more at the judgment because of what you've done for me. And what God has allowed Paul to do in this circumstance, even though his circumstances are unfair, even though his circumstances are limited, he's not allowed to do things, people are coming at him, God is still taking care of him better than He would have been taken care of otherwise. He's receiving his wants better than he would have otherwise. He is being protected in a way he would not be otherwise because of his limitations. Because if you want to beat or stone Paul, you've got to fight through the Roman soldiers to do it. But in the midst of that, God is rewarding him for what he's enduring in a way that he would not be rewarded unless he'd endured that. Not only that, but in the midst of official limitation, in the midst of persecution, in the midst of being robbed of opportunities because he's trying to honor and follow God, in the midst of that, he is still able to accomplish God's purpose. You say, I'm in jail. How am I supposed to share the gospel? I'm a preacher of the gospel. This is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to preach. How am I going to do this if I'm in jail? I'll tell you how he did it. Verse 24, after some days, Felix came down with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Felix said, I got this preacher in jail. Let's go listen to him. It's the equivalent of pulling up a YouTube video. I'm going to have him come out and preach. And Paul, who was limited to a point that he should not have been able to preach the gospel because of his limitation, was able to preach the gospel. To a guy who needed the gospel. To a guy who was in power and able to affect policy that would affect all Christians, he was able to preach to him. And in verse 25, as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed. Because he's a bad guy. He's like, I think something's starting to happen to me. I think I'm starting to feel something. I'm starting to be convicted about this. I don't like it very much. I don't like what God is doing in me. I don't like what I'm hearing about this. He was alarmed and said, go away for the present. Press pause on the YouTube video. He said, go away for the present, and when I get an opportunity, I will summon you. Verse 26, at the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. He said, one of these days, this guy's going to collect enough money that he's going to bribe me and I'm going to let him out. But Paul's like, no, that's not how we do things. I'm just going to keep preaching. And he sent for him often. Because Felix was evil and wanted a bribe, he continued to send for Paul. And because he was evil and continued to send for Paul, and Paul was limited and life was unfair, because of that, all those evil things, Paul continued to preach. and accomplish what God would have him do. Verse 27, and after 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And desiring to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul in prison. And Paul spent the rest of his life in some kind of captivity. The rest of his life was unfairness. And you know what the officials kept saying every time he would move from one level to the next level? They would say, there's no reason for him to be here. But because the legal process has started and he has appealed to Caesar, which was the right of every Roman citizen to do, was to say, no, I'm not happy with this verdict. I want Caesar to try this. Because he's appealed to Caesar, we can't stop the wheels rolling. And everywhere he went, people would say, this is stupid. Why is he in jail? Why is this happening? But his unfairness was still there. The limitation was still there. The persecution was still there. And through that persecution, his needs were still met. His wants were still met. He was still in protection of the way that he never would have been otherwise and wasn't up until that point. And not only that, but he was receiving a persecution bonus as a martyr of God because he followed God and it led him into difficulty over and over and over again. And in spite of all of that, and because of all of that, he preached to not just one, but 2 Roman governors of Judea. He went up and he preached to people everywhere he went. He's taken out and he goes on a ship and he goes to Cyprus and there he preaches. And he goes off and he tells them not to leave there. And they go off and they get shipwrecked. And he ends up on some random island. And there he gets to heal a woman. And he preaches. And people come to believe in Jesus. And he goes from official to official to official to official. And if we believe the promise that God made to him, he made it all the way up to Emperor Nero. And preached the gospel to Emperor Nero. And the only reason he was able to do that was because God allowed him to walk into unfairness. God allowed him to walk into limitation. God allowed him to have things taken from him that should not have been taken from him. It was not fair to have them taken from him, but it was, and God's purpose was accomplished anyway. And do you know what Paul received when he arrived in heaven? He moved. I don't know why it's snowing in my mind. In my mind, when Paul was executed, it's snowing and they're off somewhere. And the headsman bends him over and cuts off his head after he's been able to preach to Caesar. And he goes from captivity and unfairness and something that none of us would wish for. He goes from that being bent over and the headsman standing over him and the axe swinging down. He moves from that moment to standing before God, being blessed because he endured no matter what the circumstances were. Unfairness, persecution, limitation, all of it was used by God to take care of him as well as would have been taken care of otherwise, if not better. And you say, life's not fair. This isn't fair. I can't believe this is happening to me. I want you to stop with that for just a minute. You've got this unfairness. You've got this thing nobody else has to deal with. You've got this thing that God keeps leading you into trouble over and over and over again. And that's what we focus on, right? But I want to ask you this. How is God providing for you in spite of that? Who is God using your limitations to place you around that you would not be around if it were not for that? This other person keeps getting promoted. I'm doing the right thing. I'm honoring God. They're doing the wrong thing. They're just evil. They keep getting moved up and I stay right here. Who are you around because you stay right there? This marriage is not working. I'm trying to do everything that I can. They will not do it. It's not fair that God makes me stay in this marriage when I want out. Who is God keeping you around because of that? Your kid is sick and everybody else's kid is fine. And you say, it's not fair. Who is God placing you around that you would not be around otherwise? Because what I see God do over and over and over is lead His people into difficulty, lead His people into struggle, lead His people into limitation, lead His people into unfairness, care for them anyway, and accomplish His purpose despite that. And you know what God does on top of that? He says, because you endured this, I'm going to bless you beyond measure. Because you endured. Life's not fair. It's not. And sometimes God makes it even more unfair for His people, for their good. So what do we do? Repent for your lack of gratitude. Because we get focused on the unfairness and miss everything else it is that God is trying to do. We get focused, I'm trying to get back to the verse I want to use. We get focused on verse 22. When Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. We get focused on that and miss that the next verse is that orders were given that he should be kept in custody but have some liberty, that he should be able to go out and do what he wants to and enjoy time that nobody else gets, and that he should have his friends to come and allow him to be taken care of him without the bribes, and that for years he will endure that. We get so focused on the limitation and what God is taking care away from us and how unfair life is that we completely miss how God is taking care of us in this situation. And we are ungrateful. Life's not fair. What do I do? Repent of your lack of gratitude. Life's not fair. What do I do? Ask for help in trusting Him. The Holy Spirit was given to you to aid you as you endure. Ask for help from the Holy Spirit. Ask for help from us. Have other people gather around you and show you how God is taking care of you. We need that. Take advantage of the freedom of limitations. We think limitations, that unfairness is only robbing us, but these limitations that God allows us to walk into open up an avenue of opportunity that we would not have otherwise. What do you get to do because following God has led you into persecution, has led you into struggle, has led you into difficulty? What do you get to do that you would not do otherwise? Take advantage of the freedom of limitations. Paul did. He said, I'm in jail, and I don't get to preach to anybody else. So I'm going to preach to the people that I get to see. And that evil governor that just wanted a bribe kept calling him back in, over and over and over, hoping for a bribe. And Paul kept preaching and preaching and preaching because that was the opportunity he had. And he sent from place to place to place to place. And if you want to see something cool, just start in chapter 24 of Acts and read to the end and watch how things change around Paul. Because Paul is transferred. He's saying, well, he wants to speak to Caesar, send him to speak to Caesar. So he's transferred to Rome. And he's put under the command of a Roman centurion. And it starts off under the Roman centurion that what he does is he follows the Roman centurion around. And he does what the Roman centurion does because he's his prisoner. But by the end of the story, the Roman centurion is following him around, taking care of him. Because Paul was grateful in this circumstance, Paul took advantage of the circumstance, and this crowd of people comes around him and begins to follow him. He goes on this ship, and he says, guys, we should not get on this ship. It's too late in the year, there's going to be a storm. And they say, no, we're getting on the ship. So they get on the ship. What do you know? There's a storm. Huge storm. Kind of storm that the reason they don't sail at that time of year is because of that storm. And nobody listened to Paul, but what he kept doing is he kept preaching and he kept honoring God. And you know what they did in the midst of that storm towards the end of it? He led a worship service in a way that he would not have been able to otherwise. And that ship breaks up, and they float to land. And Paul comes up on the land and they build a fire. And out of the fire pops a snake, a deadly snake. And the snake bites him. And all the natives that are gathered around there, and it says they're especially welcoming natives. Really weird that they were this welcoming. They showed up. But the reason that they did that was so that God would be able to let everyone see Paul's snake bite. Lord, let me go to jail before I get bit by a snake. Please. I don't want to be bit by a snake. Gets this snake bites. And they all say he must be really evil because what's happened is justice has stepped in and said he survived the shipwreck, but I'm going to Final Fantasy him right here with this snake. And he shakes the snake off. And all those people recognize that he's a man of God because he survived that. And the mother-in-law of the governor of the island is sick. And they don't know what to do about it. And so his escort turns into the guy that leads him there. And he goes into this woman and he heals that woman and preaches the gospel. And that woman is saved and she would not have been otherwise. Take advantage of the freedom of your limitations. You say, I'm not being respected at work. I'm not receiving all that I should get at work because I'm honoring God and it's holding me back. What is God doing in spite of that? You say, I'm being held back by my marriage and God's things about God, what God says about my marriage, and I can't get out. I'm being held back by that. Take advantage of what God is doing in spite of that. You say, I'm enduring all this difficulty that nobody else even knows about. My kid's not sick and my marriage is not bad, but you don't understand how it weighs on me. You don't understand what it's like to deal with this. And nobody believes it's as big as it is, but it weighs on me so heavily. Take advantage of the freedom that the limitations are giving you. And understand this. God doesn't just allow you to work into circumstances and punish you because you're following Him. He doesn't just enjoy burdening His people with obedience. But He allows you to walk into a circumstance to serve Him in that circumstance, to accomplish His purpose in that circumstance. And not only that, but when the axe swings to everyone else that was standing around, there was blood and a severed head. But to the one that endured the persecution, the one that endured the limitation, the one that endured, the next moment was not a severed head and blood and sadness, but it was rejoicing and blessing. And we're still talking about him 2,000 years later. You're limited. How's God taking care of you through that? What's He allowing you to do through that? And what's He calling you to do today? Would you stand with me, please? Our Heavenly Father, Lord, I wanted to preach something else today. But this is the message that you would allow me to write. And as I look around at the tears around the room, as I look around at the struggles around the room, I'm grateful, Lord, that you know more than me. And that you will deliver the message that you have for your people. And I ask that my limitations and my failures and my mistakes would not get in the way of what you want to do here today. But rather that your Spirit would apply it as it needs to be applied, Lord. I ask that you would allow us to be grateful in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the limitation. I ask that you would show us the opportunities that we have that we would not have otherwise, Lord. And I ask that whatever it is that's going on, whether it's the marriage, the job, the family, whether it's mental health or something else that we're wandering into that's not fair, that nobody else is having to deal with, I ask that your hand would be upon us and that you would guide us, that we might serve you in the way that you would have us to, Lord. It's in Jesus' name I pray.